Hello. We are going to be covering Chapter 1 in Cyber Law and Ethics today. So we're going to start off with some ideas about the Internet and ethics. Primary focus of this chapter is the ethical issues on the Internet. The Internet is a paradox. It empowers people and gives them an opportunity to exercise free speech, but the same technology that made the Internet viable is also being used to control those rights. So, for example, blocking software. In China, anything the government doesn't want you to see is officially blocked. In other places in the world, they have various measures of censorship, and of course they're using the same technology that created the Internet. So this class is going to look at ethics and philosophy, and what that is a collection of structures or methods to analyze moral dilemmas and social problems. So the first part of our class, we're going to look at an overview of traditional philosophical frameworks. In other words, what we're really looking at is when you're faced with an ethical problem, how do you answer it? And there are different perspectives on what is important and what is not important, and we're going to be looking at those. First, we have to define ethical norms. These are standards that distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Most people learn these norms at home, at school, in church, or other social settings. We usually learned what's right and wrong during our childhood, so when we poke our brother or sister for fun and mom and dad yell at us, then we learn that poking our sibling is wrong. Moral development, however, does occur throughout our entire life. So something that you might be willing to do when you're a teenager, you may be less willing to do when you're in your 30s or 40s. Somebody who has just recently been married would probably not cheat on their spouse. However, somebody who has been married for 5 or 6 years is much more likely to. Ethical norms are so ubiquitous that one might be tempted to regard them as simple common sense. On the other hand, if morality were nothing more than common sense, then why are there so many ethical disputes and issues in our society? And basically, what you need to think about is how every social issue in this country there is a debate about. So, for example, we can look at things like euthanasia, whether or not somebody who is dying should have the right to pick the time and date of their death. Gay weddings, who defined marriage in the United States as between a man and a woman. We have to look at these things through not just the legal aspect, but also through the moral aspect of is it right or wrong to do. So, Larry Lessig is a Harvard law professor, and he has been a very vocal proponent of reduced legal constraints on cyber regulations. So, in terms of modern-day philosophers, he's really the guy who specifically looks at the world of the Internet in relation to philosophy. Now, according to Lessig, there are 4 constraints that regulate our behavior. Meaning there's 4 ways that our behavior is managed. First, we have laws. These are rules imposed by the government that are enforced through sanctions. So in the real world, we talk about things like speed limits or the IRS doing an audit on you. And in the cyber world, we look at something like copyright laws. Number 2, we have norms. These are standards that a community considers normal. So in the real world, most people don't smoke cigars indoors if they have children. In the cyber world, we try to avoid spamming our friends unless we're messing with them. Third of Lessig's constraints is called market forces. This is supply and demand. So in the real world, we look at an example like a price of gas going up in the summer because people tend to travel more in the summer. In the cyber world, advertisers tend to focus more on popular sites. So The more traffic a site gets, the more likely advertisers will want to promote their product on that site. And then last but not least, Lessig's constraints include codes and architecture, and these are constraints that are placed on us either through geography, like mountains, or construction, like buildings. These constraints are not controlled through coercion. There's no punishment. So in the real world, buildings usually have windows. Roads usually have speed limits. These are the things that are just conventional. It's not that there's anyone out there saying that every building must have a window. In fact, you'll often find storage warehouses that have no windows. In the cyber world, we have codes that will limit the availability of access by demanding a username and password. So again, logging into our email, there's no requirement for us to have a password or email, but because of our need for privacy, we want that. So again, what we look at are these codes are kind of the unwritten rules. We also need to examine the concept of cultural norms, which are rules that govern social behavior. So what is normal in one country may not be normal in another. So, example, in Saudi Arabia, women are always expected to wear a burqa when they are in public. In the United States, a cultural norm is that we go to the movies and we get popcorn, whereas in another country it might be a different snack. And that seems kind of minor compared to a woman being forced to wear a burqa, but cultural norms don't necessarily have to be extravagantly rule-based. Something like, what are you having on Thanksgiving? If you say ham, people are going to be like, what? You're supposed to have turkey. Again, these are just cultural norms. Society relies on metanorms. These are the universal guidelines that tell people to punish transgressors of norms. So, for example, corruption must be punished, especially when it comes to somebody in government or the police. Otherwise, everyone will begin to do it. So you see policemen, especially when they are corrupt, they're really treated very harshly by the criminal justice system, because the criminal justice system is sending a message to any other police person who might be considering corruption as a viable way of earning some extra money. Then we have something called the master principle of morality. These are the choices that should always be open to the fulfillment of persons and communities. So, for example, a good use of regulatory codes is blocking software to prevent children from seeing pornography. And again, a 5-year-old doesn't have either the cognitive or social skills to understand what they may be seeing. So it really is in their best interest to have this kind of stuff blocked. The ultimate human good is humans flourishing. So in other words, whatever will help humans move forward and be successful is a good thing. This should define the basis for creating laws, developing social institutions, and regulating the internet. So this master principle of morality is a concept that, not a lot of countries today really follow. But if you look at the countries in Northern Europe, like Sweden, Finland, Norway, these are countries that really do follow this master principle of morality. So let's start talking about some specific philosophers. And of course, one of the most famous 20th century philosophers is Heidegger. In his essay, The Question Concerning Technology, which was published in 1954, he asked, what is technology and how do we relate to technology? Now, before I finish talking about what's on the slide, keep in mind that at the end of World War II, in 1945, the United States used the atomic bomb twice in Japan. And this really set off a suspicion of technology, because prior to this, most technological advances that had been made in the early 20th century and late 19th century, including things like the car, the airplane, various manufacturing processes, had been very positive. Now we're seeing technology has the ability to destroy. So this is an era in which he is working in that people are very suspicious of technology, and it makes them uneasy. We're already beginning to see in 1954 the Soviet Union and the US involved in the Cold War. So again, what we see is this is a kind of a scary time. Also, what you have to know about Heidegger is he was a Nazi sympathizer. So ultimately in 1945, when the Germans surrendered, his side essentially lost. So he is very suspicious of technology, which makes him a technological pessimist. So he answers the question, how do we relate to technology? And what is technology in this way? First, what is technology? Technology is a means to an end, and technology is a human activity. Technology is not the mere process of making, but also serves as the fundamental mode of revealing the potential of the world. So that's actually a pretty positive context in terms of, technology really gives us the opportunity for the world to be improved. But Heidegger, again, very, very negative in his perception. In terms of how we relate to technology, he believed the actual problem lies in our orientation to technology. In other words, how we relate to it. Problems brought about by technology cannot be solved simply by making the technology better. It's all the problems in society are not going to be solved because the next iPhone is a better phone or a better interface. Next, it's impossible to ignore these difficulties simply by opting out of technology. And again, even though we may try to opt out of technology, it becomes harder and harder to opt out. Ultimately, Heidegger sees technology as oppressive and dehumanizing. And, for those of us who try to unhook once in a while, it can be very oppressive because we are so tied into communicating on a regular basis with people that it's very challenging at times to just unhook and not talk to anyone, not interact, not read Reddit, not get on Facebook. Another technological pessimist is Jacques Ellul. In his essay, The Technological Society, he argues that efficiency has become the dominant factor in terms of society's values. So, he believed that technology shaped the way we live, the way we work, the way we interact. But it's all about being efficient, which takes away some of the idea of, creativity. Going from point A to point B might be a straight line, and that makes it the most efficient. But what if taking a long drive through the mountains to get to point E is way more beautiful? So, again, it is seen as dehumanizing in a sense. Then we have Max Weber, who was a sociologist. He called technology an iron cage to explain how technology locks us into certain patterns of behavior. And we get stuck in these behaviors because that's the way it is, and that's the way we do things, and we don't question them. Then we have technological neutralists. They argue that technology is a neutral force dependent upon humanity's objectives. So technology is free from bias. Technology does not promote one type of behavior over another. Technology is a tool. Technology does not compromise our freedom. It does not determine our destiny. And ultimately, it's humanity that determines if technology is used for good or bad. And, this kind of thing, many of us might sit in the view that technology is neutral. It's how we use it that becomes good or bad. So probably a lot of us might feel this way. Ultimately, though, if the technology didn't exist, would humans look to create something similar for bad or for good? And thankfully, most people in humanity want to do things for good. Then you have your technological utopianisms. This is people who believe that certain technologies can make possible an ideal world with improved lifestyles and workplaces. So it assumes that humanity can control technology's negative effects, and it assumes that humanity can use technology to improve the human condition. And look at the technology that's used in healthcare today. Back in the early 1900s, the life expectancy was in the mid-40s. Now it's in the mid-70s, late 70s. And the reason for this is, to a small extent, better nutrition. We're taking care of ourselves. To a much larger extent, it is the technology that was developed through the 20th century in the healthcare field. Things like artificial hearts, being able to inject people with diabetes with insulin so they could manage their blood sugar better. All of these technological advances, a utopianist would point to and say, look, this is what we've been able to do. Then we have technological realists. They believe that technology is a force in its own right, but is subject to political and social forces. So in a sense, kind of think of the movie Terminator in a way. Human behavior is influenced by technology. Technology has changed politics and society. There's been many articles written about how Barack Obama became president during his first term because of how efficiently and effectively he was utilizing social media and emailing and contacting people via the internet, as opposed to his the people who he was going up against, who didn't have that machine that really worked the internet. And of course now everybody is all over using the internet for their political gains. Humans have the power to subdue or redirect the way technology impacts our behavior, politics, and society. And humans control how technology is deployed or restrained. So in the same way that we can put passwords on things so that our little brother or sister isn't getting in and reading our emails, we also then have the government utilizing technology to spy on us through the National Security Agency. So again, what we see here is going back to almost that neutralist perspective, but realizing that technology does have a significant impact on us, and we may not even realize what an impact it has on us. We can avoid technological pessimism if we adopt an ethical or moral system as we evaluate technological opportunities and make ground rules for the digital frontier. Various frameworks for an ethical system already exist. They can be standalone frameworks, or they can work in conjunction with one another. These frameworks exist as a way to assess complex moral issues. Now, before we get to the specific frameworks, we need to understand that these frameworks fit in two categories: teleological versus deontological. Teleological are theories that argue that the rightness or wrongness of an action depends upon the intended end. So the end justifies the means. The old Machiavellian concept from the Renaissance that political leaders have been using for the past 400 or 500 years. Then we have deontological. These theories consider actions to be intrinsically right or wrong, regardless of the consequences. And these theories emphasize duty and obligation. So if you have not called your mom in weeks, deontologically, that is wrong, because we're supposed to stay in contact and be respectful of our parents. So first we're going to look at a teleological theory called Utilitarianism. And this was developed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 1700s, early 1800s, and then expanded by John Stuart Mill in the mid 1800s. Utilitarianism believes that the one correct action to take is one that promotes the general good. So the best action is one that has the greatest possible balance of good over bad for the greatest number of people. So, for example, you buy a car that gets good gas mileage instead of a sleek, sexy sports car. But that good gas mileage also helps the environment. It helps the economy because you are able to spend money on other things other than gas, and so on and so forth. The issue, again, with this utilitarian idea is that the end justifies the means. So, not in every circumstance is utilitarianism going to be a positive outlook. Interestingly, just a little trivia, Jeremy Bentham, when he died, he left money in his will for his body to be essentially mummified and put on display. And you'll see here there's a little cartoon-ish kind of thing, drawing of Jeremy Bentham sitting in a glass case, and that's exactly how he appears today. Actually, you can go see him. I think he's in one of the universities in London, Oxford or Cambridge, and his body is still there, and you can go take a look and say hi and kind of get your selfie done with Jeremy Bentham. So there you go. Now, the downside, what happens when human rights conflict with utility? So, example, the NSA accessing our online information. So, should human rights be suppressed for the common good? And, we've already given up a lot of rights, if you think about it, in terms of how our human rights have been subjugated to the needs of the national security. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean it's right or wrong. It's just whether your perspective, what your framework is when assessing right and wrong. The criticism is that this theory lacks sensitivity to the ideas of justice and human rights. Then we have contract rights, which is a deontological theory. It examines moral issues from the perspective of human rights that might be at stake. A right is something a population is entitled to. The consequences of an action are morally irrelevant, and this is as opposed to utilitarianism. So in the United States, according to our Constitution, we have the right to privacy, we have the right to free speech, we have the right to practice a religion, and again, when we look at these things that have rights, there's also restrictions. Yelling fire in a crowded building when there is no fire is not free speech. It's inflammatory, both in a pun way and a real way. But the idea here is that if we are entitled to this right, how we use the right is irrelevant. So, examples of contract rights. A negative right, one is free from external interference in one's affairs. So, our right of privacy, for example. So, if you want to have a marriage between 3 different people, somebody in this contract right would say, well, that's my right of privacy. Positive rights, one must be provided with something to pursue one's legitimate interests. So public education, for example, is a positive right. And again, different countries have different rights that they see as absolute. So for example, in many countries in Europe, healthcare is considered a right. In this country, one of the biggest rights that we have is voting. We have the right to vote once we hit the age of 18, and it allows us to help steer the direction of the country. And yet, most elections go by with very few people interacting and voting. So, just because we have the right doesn't mean we take advantage of it. This also includes something called social contract philosophy. John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and John Rawls believe we have basic rights because of an implicit social contract between the individual and civilized society. So we're guaranteed certain rights, for example, life and liberty, in exchange for following the laws and regulations of society. And if you think about the death penalty in the United States, this is a perfect example of a social contract. The idea here is that we have the right to life and liberty as long as we don't break any of the major rules, first-degree murder, killing a cop, killing a child. These are the laws and regulations that can get us put in the chair, so to speak, or for lethal injection. And because we have violated those laws, we have given up our right to life and liberty. So, of course, there are problems with social contract theory. It's not always so clear-cut in the cyber world. So, for example, the person who sends spam claims that they are exercising their free speech, but the person who receives the spam can claim that their right of privacy is being trespassed against. The problem lies in how this is addressed by the judicial powers, and there is no easy answer. Think about if you send out spam. Let's say you send out 50,000 emails about some new concert or some new singer that you really like, and you send it to every person you've ever had an email contact with, and everybody at your school, everybody at your old school, in high school, everybody. And now what you're doing is you're filling up their inbox, you're using the servers for the mail, and so there is a lot of considerations, and these are things that we're going to be talking about in this class as we move through the chapters. Then we have another deontological theory, which is called pluralism or moral duty. And this is based on the moral philosophy of Immanuel Kant. One should always strive to identify and carry out one's moral duty. So consequences of an action are morally irrelevant. It's all about the action itself, and the action should be defined by our duty. So according to Kant, our moral duty is defined by a rational moral law that is universal. So, for example, do not kill. So, rationally, we all know that we shouldn't kill each other. However, think about it from the perspective of you enter the military and you're sent off to Afghanistan or Syria or wherever we're going to end up next, and they put a gun in your hands and they say you have to kill as many terrorists as you can. What Kant would say is that is not a moral duty. So pluralism is also known as the categorical imperative, the obligation to do one's duty for its own sake and not in pursuit of further ends, no exceptions. Kant believed we had perfect duties we are always obliged to follow, such as telling the truth or keeping a promise. And it's similar to the principle of fair play. We should never make exceptions for our own gain. So let's look at the relevance of a very old theory to the very recent and modern idea in cyberspace, which is stealing is wrong. So if we apply this to intellectual property rights, we all download music or a movie illegally because everyone does it. But the action in and of itself is self-defeating because it leads to the destruction of the entire practice of intellectual property protection. And think about it. If an artist, an actor, a director, a producer, a singer, they don't make any money from the art they create, will they continue to create the art and distribute it? Some artists will. Some artists toil away in obscurity for their entire lives, whereas other artists would say, nope, I gotta feed my kids, I gotta raise my standard of living, and I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to go out and get myself a job in accounting. So, when we look at this in that context, it is an immoral action. So when we make exceptions just for ourselves, we are committing an immoral act. And of course, this is one of my favorite cartoons. Did you catch the TV documentary about illegal file sharing is growing? And of course, the kid says, no, I'll go download it, which, and of course, is going to probably be illegal file sharing. So, limitations to pluralism. It is accepted that Kant's philosophy is almost too rigid because it doesn't allow for acting towards the greater good. So, for example, going to defeat the Nazis was for the greater good. So, more specifically, an example, we know it's wrong to lie, but what if lying would save someone's life? According to Kant, this is still immoral. More recently, in the 20th century, William D. Ross attempted to soften Kant's inflexibility by proposing that our duties are conditional and not absolute. His point is that when duties conflict with one another, one duty can supersede another duty if it is judged to be superior. So what is the more important duty? Do I save the lives of women and children, or do I pursue the enemy? So somebody who is in that scenario of a wartime and they're trying to protect people but also kill the enemy, they deal with these ethical decisions on a regular basis. He too, however, emphasizes that one's duty cannot be overridden for selfish purposes. The last theoretical or philosophical framework we're going to be examining in this lecture is the new natural law, which attempts to combine teleological and deontological theories. It was developed by John Finnis and Germain Grisez based on the philosophy of the Catholic priest St. Thomas Aquinas. The first principle, good should be done and evil should be avoided. Again, sounds pretty easy to follow. The imperatives, we should never act out of hostility, we should never act out of vengeance, and we should never choose evil to achieve a good end. So killing someone to achieve something positive, again, is not seen as a positive thing. So this is the last slide, and I just basically want you to look at how these operative questions address each theory. So in utilitarianism, we have to look at is which action or policy generates the best overall consequences or the greatest net expectable utility for all affected parties. With pluralism or duty-based morality, is the principle of fair play being violated? If there appears to be conflicting duties, which is the stronger duty? Then we have rights-based morality or contract rights. Which action or policy protects the human and legal rights of the individual involved? And then last but not least is our new natural law. Does the proposed action or policy promote the basic requirements of human flourishing? Does it impede, damage, or destroy any of the basic human good? So, as we move through the next chapters, these four frameworks are really super important, and this particular slide should be something that you keep handy. If you have any questions, please email or text me. Otherwise, have a phenomenal day.